Hi everyone, my name is Jane McLean. I'm a fourth year linguistics major, and I'm excited to share my honors thesis titled Exploring Sibilants and Gender, a lesson from transgender speakers. In this study I focused on what sociophoneticians love so much, which is S, sibilant consonants. It's something that's been looked at to examine how different social axes like class, race, and gender have been expressed in language, in production. And so the previous literature has kind of already divided this up into women, men, of course, being cis women, cis men, and then those with complex profiles, which are LGBTQ plus speakers, and then as well as trans people, which I'm using here as an umbrella term to include anyone who identifies their gender identity as different than what they were assigned at birth. And so not necessarily somebody who's completely, transitioned from one gender to another, but anyone who falls anywhere else on the gender spectrum. Um, and so previous studies on S have found that women tend to have higher center of gravity frequencies for the S, the like spectral frequency, the intensity of it is higher for women, lower for men, but then also those lower in men as compared to, say, gay men or trans men, those who are more complex in their profile. And so I wanted to look into specifically trans women, since that is not a population that's been thoroughly researched as compared to trans men. Though of course more research can always be done. But Dr. Lal Zeman over at UCSB has done a lot of work, especially back in 2017, working with 15 transgender men and transmasculine individuals. And so kind of basing a lot of my sort of goals for this study on his goals from his work, I wanted to ask, what are the S frequency ranges for the trans women and trans feminine speaker sample? So I'm looking at spontaneous speech and scripted speech. And then also, are they stratified in any way by their gender presentation, identity, or sexual identity, as Zeman found with his participants? And I hypothesizing two things: that one, regardless of gender identity, expression, or sexuality, the speakers will exhibit a higher center of gravity in the reading tasks than in the interview. So, exhibit higher in the scripted speech as opposed to the spontaneous speech. And then that the center of gravities will meaningfully vary and differ in conjunction with their gender identity, expression, and sexuality, where, for example, queer androgynous speakers will differ greatly from, more heteronormative feminine speakers. So for my methodology, I had 5 speakers in total who I really got to know and discuss all of this with. They were trans women and then non-binary trans feminine people. So that's kind of what I mean by people who fall all over the spectrum, where gender is not just a binary of men and women. And then these people were from the UO community and ranged from 18 to 26 years old. And so I just did simple interviews with them and then had the short reading passage and word list as well. And so for analyzing, I threw these all in the audio software prop, segmented, filtered, extracted, and then used Kendall and Friendland's 2021 prop script to extract the sibilant measurements that I wanted to then annotate and analyze the center of gravities. So what I found is that the participants greatly varied. They both greatly varied, but also were very similar in that none of my participants were identified as straight. They all identified in some queer identity other than, being heterosexual. And then, but they were similar in that way, but then different in that I had some who identified as being trans women, but then others who were more androgynous and non-binary in their identities. And so this is how we see such a huge range, for example, with Calypso, who is ranging around 3,000 hertz in the interview, and then down to, say, just Luna right below is at 6,800 hertz, which is a lot more stereotypical, as we can see here, comparing to the ranges I have listed on the right. That's more, in line with cis women's frequency ranges as found, while Calypso's would be not even below the cis men range found. So interesting in that their ranges did seem to kind of follow along with their identity and expression. But then, kind of looking further into that, I really wanted to ensure that the differences and the variation in the center of gravities I'm finding isn't just something linguistic happening. It's not just a linguistic factor that's actually causing this. And so I looked at some different phonological, no, I'm sorry, not phonological, phonetic differences. There is a difference. Um, and so that being position and then the environment. So position being whether the S comes at the beginning of the word, it's a word initial, like in street, or if it's word medial, comes, somewhere within the word, like in absolute. And then the environment has to do with whether or not the S occurred um, in like preceding a vowel kind of as like a singleton where it's like it starts the syllable in absolute versus like in street it's part of that consonant cluster str. It's like that one thing. And so I did actually find that there were higher center of gravities for word initial than opposed to word medial. And then, interestingly, lower center of gravity for clusters as opposed to the preceding vowel, or as I'm trying to also refer to as singletons, um, in terms of environment. And so that was interesting to find because it was, it followed the same trajectory for each speaker. It wasn't super, like, no one speaker had one way, like, oh, they actually had a super high center of gravity when everyone else had low. And so following that, for that was of course those data was from the interview. These are now from the reading passage and word list. Same sort of trends happening where everything looks the same, which like is kind of boring, but is also important to understand that okay, there's not something linguistic happening here. There might be something social happening, which is what I'm trying to argue. Is that yes, there is something social happening with their identity and with their expression that is ultimately being realized in their speech. So this is then going into the within speaker analysis I did, where I was talking about how the speakers would not vary across the reading passage and the word list. And so I was kind of clumping those together as scripted speech and spontaneous speech being the interview. And I was saying that one's going to be different than the other. What I actually found is that the reading passage and the word list varied from each other. And so this was important to find and then take into consideration that in both the reading passage and the word list, the center of gravity, the frequencies that I'm extracting, they're all coming from the same words. I have the same target words in both instances. However, the difference here is that, of course, in the reading passage, you're reading it in a phrase. The word you're going to be reading is in a phrase, in a sentence, versus in the word list, it's just in isolation. It's, cemetery, abstract, and so that interestingly did show to make a difference for some speakers. And I'm still trying to maybe come up with some conclusions as to why. That was not something I expected, obviously. So really exciting. And so, of course, the title of this was A Lesson from Transgender Speakers. What's the lesson? The lesson is that speakers maintain stylistic variations that patterned with their gender identity and expression. So, like what I was saying with these center of gravities, that showing that there wasn't a linguistic difference, there was some sort of stylistic difference happening with how they identify. And then also that my little small empirical study here reveals that there's a lot more research that needs to be done. Um, for example, further research on the voice training. Voice training is something that trans women have to do, as opposed to trans men who are on T. The T, on T meaning they are on hormone therapy, which is testosterone, and it actually does affect the vocal cords. It lowers their voice, and for trans women being on estrogen, that's not the case. And so there is some sort of voice training ties that can be linked to this. And so I'm curious if like some of those strategies, like manipulating fundamental frequency, their resonance, and then the breathiness, how that might tie into this. So there are my references, and I appreciate you all listening, and I hope you got to learn a little bit something about trans voices.